You found the Backup Wrap-Up, your go-to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we explore how to get an actual return on your investment out of your backups instead of just treating them as an expensive insurance policy that sits around and waits for a disaster. Ask yourself, what if your backup infrastructure could actually pay dividends, make your company money? Prasanna and I dig into practical ways to extract an ROI from your backups through test environments, security monitoring, compliance checking, and even, and especially these days, AI-powered analytics. We'll show you how the shift from tape to disk opened up these possibilities that were honestly simply impossible before. If you've ever wondered whether there's more to backup than just crossing your fingers and hoping that you'll never need to use them, well, this episode's for you. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. And I've been doing backups for over 30 years, basically ever since I had to tell my boss that there were no backups of the production database that we had just lost. I didn't want that to happen to me again, and I don't want that to happen to you. That's why I do this. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show. Hi, welcome to Backup Central's Restore It All podcast. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, and with me, as always, is my fellow DIY enthusiast, Prasanna Malayandi. Welcome to the club, Prasanna.
Thank you, Curtis. Although, to be fair, this is not my first DIY.
No, it's not, but I don't know. I just feel like this was something special.
But it's the first one where I've had to make multiple trips to Home Depot in order to figure out. And so it's funny. So to explain what's going on, so over the weekend, I had a water shutoff valve for our sprinkler system that was leaking. So I was like, okay, I should fix it because it's starting to get summertime and it's probably best to do that. So I was like, oh, let me try. And I've been delaying this, by the way, for a year and a half. So It's not like all of a sudden it started leaking. Like, I basically just turned it off because then it would stop leaking. So it hasn't been working for a year and a half.
So no sprinkling.
Yeah. No sprinkling. I literally would fill up, like, you know those, I don't know if you have a Costco, but Costco sells like the mango juices in like those giant like half-gallon or 1 gallon containers, the Langers. I would fill that with water from the kitchen sink and then go and water the plants. So yes, so eventually I was like, okay, I should fix this. So I was like, okay, YouTubed it, and I'm like, oh, it's one of those plastic shutoff valves that has a ball. So I was like, okay, I know it's going to be difficult if I have to replace it because you have to like PVC, you got to put glue, you got to piece everything together. I'm like, that's a huge project. I was like, let me do the easy way first. So I Googled on YouTube and they're like, hey, there's this O-ring inside that leaks. And so what you do is you just like pull off the handle and then pull out the O-ring and replace the O-ring and put it back together and you're all good to go. So I was like, sweet. So I started on that. And in the process of removing the handle, I broke the handle.
Yeah.
And I went to like 5 different stores, bought 5 different valves and took them apart to see if one of the handles, because I was like, oh, let me just replace the handle. None of the handles would fit.
Nice.
So then I was like, oh man. So now I was like, okay, I'm screwed. So then I was like, okay, I got to bite the bullet. What was going to hopefully be like a 30-minute project has now gone on for an hour and a half. And I hadn't even been to the first store yet. So I went to the Home Depot and I met this one really awesome guy who works there. And Eric, shout out to you. But he was like, hey, this is exactly what you need. And he's like, hey, instead of doing what you're thinking of doing, you should just replace everything. You'll be much happier. And he like told me exactly what I needed. He walked me through it.
Yeah.
Bought everything, took it home, and then started putting it together. Because remember, at this point, we don't have water in the house.
Right.
And so we started putting everything together, called Curtis a bunch of times, put it together. I was like, it dripped, it leaked. I was like, oh. So then slowly like tightened it and all the rest. And so at least now I have water in the house. I haven't finished the rest of the sprinkler stuff, but there's a slight drip. So now I have to shut off the water and redo everything. But it was like 4 trips to Home Depot, and
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but and you know what you did wrong at this point. You know what the problem is. Yeah.
Yep. And I talked to my DIY expert, otherwise known as Mr. Backup, and he was like, "Send me a picture." So I sent you a picture, and you looked at it, and you're like, "You put the Teflon tape on backwards." I was like, "Oh,
yeah."
So
Got to put
at
the
least I know.
Teflon tape in the direction of the threads. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's also one of those things because it was like it's going in the opposite direction because it had double-sided thread. So I was like,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's okay. At least I know what I need to do, but now I got to shut off the water and then do that. So yeah.
You had a whole, but I mean, the thing that I saw, there were a whole bunch of threads because you got like the nipple plus the adapter plus the shut up,
Shut off valve and then the thing going in the PVC. And so, yeah. But hopefully it's not too much longer and I won't need to go back to Home Depot, but we shall see.
Oh, don't say things like that.
At least for this project.
Yeah. And we're not even going to talk about why I'm mad at Home Depot right now. So let's just say for the first time ever, I'm actually hiring them to do something, and it has not been a fun process. But.
Which is the exact opposite, because normally I'm not a fan of Home Depot because I can never find someone to help me.
Yeah.
We've talked about this on the podcast before, and you love Home Depot because you're like, I know exactly what I need, and now our roles are reversed. So
yeah, weird.
Must be a full moon.
It's well, actually, you know what today is? The day we're recording it. It's Halley's Comet Day.
Oh, I was going to say it was Cinco de Mayo.
They're saying, yeah, it is Cinco de Mayo, but they're saying tonight and tomorrow night we should get some real meteor showers
nice.
From Halley's Comet. So anyway, well, we are going to talk about some fun stuff today. We talk about in backup a lot. One of the issues that people have with backup is that it's just a money sink, right? A money pit, right? It's just, it never brings any value to the business until
you need it.
Until you really
it's
really
insurance, right? It's like your car insurance, your house insurance, whatever.
Exactly. Else. Right. And like most insurance, it adds no value to your life unless really bad things happen, right? Yep. And so this episode is about, are there other things that we could be doing with our backups that would potentially, at least, I don't know, add some incremental business value, or whatever the appropriate term is in the governmental world, right? Incremental value to the organization that would help minimize the pain of that check. That dates me, doesn't it?
Yes.
Just the fact that I used the term check.
The Bitcoins that you have to use, or this?
Yeah, the Bitcoins. I'll tell a story from the old days. So I remember back when the organization that I was, my very first job.
Before you start, you have to use the phrase. What phrase do you have to use when you go back?
Back in the day.
There you go.
So back in the day, back in 1993, before my daughter was even born, that we ran out of the organization was growing in size, just logarithmically, really, from the time I joined to the time I left, and which always means more backups, and it means running out of tapes. Back then, it meant running out of tapes, and I remember going to my boss and basically saying, "Hey, we're out of tapes," and it was interesting because purchases for over a certain number was considered a capital purchase, even though this was really very much an expense. So it was a very big deal that I was asking for. I remember the number was $16,000 in tapes, and which is a lot of tapes, right? Yeah. But we needed a lot of tapes, and I remember my boss saying to me, Susan, saying to me, is there any other option
Mm.
than spending this
Fine.
$16,000? And I said, yes. She said, what is it? I can stop backing up stuff.
Or it should be like, you should stop creating data.
Yeah, you could stop making more stuff. Um, so backups have always been this like money sink. I'm sorry, why do I keep saying money sink, money pit? I will also say that there have been some changes in backup design that are going to facilitate some of the things that we talk about when we talk about bringing some business value out of the backup data. The biggest of which is moving off of tape
Yep.
as the primary backup mechanism. Because when backups were on tape, and backups are still on tape, there's still quite a bit of backups on tape. But when it was the primary and only place that you stored backup data, getting any additional value out of that data was, I mean, it's just literally something that we never even discussed because there was no way to do it.
Well, and I think it's also at the time, I don't think people thought about these other use cases because they may not have existed back then, right? I think modern software architecture and designs have allowed for a lot more use cases than what they used to have in the past.
Yeah, but I would also say, even though like when we look at things like test and dev, we had test and dev, but the best you could do was use your backups to restore production into something. Yeah. And it was still so challenging that most people just didn't even think about it, right? They just didn't even consider that as an option.
Yeah, but I think this is also where, if we look at storage systems like NetApp at the time, right, with snapshots, where it's like, hey, and clones, right, you can quickly take a clone of a volume, start using it for test and dev and other purposes like that. So I think that was like, oh yeah, we should be able to do more things with it. Yeah. And actually, maybe we should just jump into like some of these use cases since we're already alluding to it.
Well, actually, before we do that, I think that it's really important that you made an important point there, and that is that when I said that there have been some changes in backup design, there have been sort of two really big changes. One is just the use of disk in general in various forms, which includes just file system disk. It includes object-based storage. It includes filer-based type storage and dedupe storage. All of that it's just much more flexible. Even if we did nothing else, that provides a lot of flexibility. But I do think that when I look back on things, I think NetApp gets a lot of credit here as being a pioneer of not changing just that we're going to use disk for backups, but also how we're going to make those backups. Yeah. And for a really long time, there was this, and I'll still stand by the phrase if we leave it just alone, and that is that a snapshot isn't a backup, right? If we go back 20 years, NetApp's at least 20 years old, right?
More than 20 years, I think it was.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So back when NetApp was just NetApp and pre-SnapMirror, that there was a time when there was no SnapMirror, right?
Yep.
Okay. So when it was just a box and it had just snapshots, I would have been alongside everyone else saying a snapshot is not a backup, right?
Because
it's relying on the primary.
Yeah.
Right? A traditional snapshot at that time, well, even a snapshot at this time, relies on the primary. It's literally, I used to make the phrase, a snapshot is as good of a backup of your data as a snapshot of your house is when your house catches fire. Right? It relies on the primary in order to function. But then once NetApp and other companies followed their example, they started replicating these snapshots to other locations. And now we have both versioning, that's what snapshots brought, was versioning, and also replication. So we have another copy of the data in another location. But once they did that, because now we're storing backups in a way that is immediately useful, you don't have to restore, as I make quotes in the air, you don't have to restore it per se, you just need to make it available.
Yeah.
And then if we look at modern systems, there are also backup vendors that have kind of led this charge as
Mm.
well, where they're storing backups. So traditionally, most backup vendors have stored their backups in some sort of encapsulated format. TAR, for example, with NetBackup. Networker had their, what did they call that? Their open tape format? Is that what they call it?
I don't remember. It's been too
Well,
long.
anyway. Yeah. So they had their format. Every backup vendor had their format, right?
It's great for
Um,
proprietary and lock-in, but
yeah. It
it
was,
also but it
yeah.
also allows them to optimize what they
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
needs to be done.
Yeah. So traditionally, that's what they did. When I look back on the first company that I remember really doing what I'm thinking about here is Veeam,
Mm-hmm.
where they started storing their backups in a native format.
Yeah.
So that and originally I remember, like, when they were kind of early, I remember me not liking the fact that you couldn't search their backups.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, you don't need to search it. You just mount.
Yep.
You just mount the VM from 2 days ago and just go get whatever you want. And at the time, I remember going, I don't like that. Right? I want to search my, you know.
Yeah.
But this really it was a new way of storing backups so that you could instantly access that data, and that led to this idea of things like instant restores.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You want to describe what an instant restore is?
Yeah, an instant restore is, well, before we get to instant restore, so your typical restore is you have to first sort of copy the data out of the system, right, to wherever it needs to go to the target system, and then you could start the recovery process if there needs
Right.
to be one, right? Instant restore is you don't need to do that copy. You can instantly access the data from that backup system and start using it. And then you could do things like, okay, if it's a virtual machine, I can mount it and start running it off the backup storage system. And then I can move it or migrate it using storage vMotion or other technologies to the production location without any downtime. So it allows you to
Yeah.
sort of reduce the RTO in
Yeah.
order to be able to start accessing your data.
Definitely reduces the RTO, right? Well, technically reduces the RTA, the recovery
Yes.
time actual. Yes, it allows you to meet. I'm such a pedantic
That's
jerk
okay.
sometimes, because the RTO shouldn't change, right?
Yeah.
Unless we're like, hey, we can have a tighter RTO now, right? So the objective could be made tighter, but and this, I think that's the first one that I really remember doing it like that. There are other ways to do it. There are other ways where if you don't put everything inside encapsulated blobs, right, like tar, if you're storing everything as lots of little pieces, if you're able to then put all those pieces together and just present them all at the same time as an image, that's another way to do instant restore.
Yeah.
But the point is these newer ways of storing backups have allowed this ability to access data in a random fashion without the massive need to do a big restore right before you can do anything.
Yeah. And I know that we're talking about sort of instant restores, but I look at that as a technology, and then there are the use cases on top of it. Right.
Exactly.
So
right.
Doing instant restore is one use case. The next one that also comes to mind is test and dev, which I think Veeam was one of the first to sort of solidify this and actually lead the market in this space.
Yeah.
So you have a backup, you want to verify, did things work right? And the problem is that you would need to create your own sort of test environment, spin it up, right? Configure it, copy the data out, potentially all the rest. And Veeam made it very easy where you can almost create an isolated test environment in VMware automatically, right? Restore your VM or spin up your VM there with new IP addresses so there's no conflicts, everything else. Access it, do whatever testing you need, and then sort of tear down the system.
Yeah, and you can actually create this is called Sure Backup in Veeam, and you could create basically a recovery group, and it will do all of this together, right? And so you can test an entire environment together. And what that's doing is it's just adding, at least initially what we're talking about is just testing the backup to make sure it works. So what you're doing is you're increasing confidence in that your backup system can do what it needs to do when it needs to do it, right?
Yep.
But what that also does is when you have the ability to access data like live like that, whether we're talking via the snapshot way, the live backup way, or the live restore way, or instant recovery way, in any method that allows you to directly mount the backup, read write, right? Now, you need to do that in a way, by the way, that doesn't impact the backup, right? Yeah. You need to create like a view, to use a database term. You need to create a view into that backup that allows you to, because in order to mount it and actually turn it on as a VM, you're going to need to do read write. Yep. So you need to do that in a way that doesn't impact the original backup, right? Yep. Any of those methods that allow, I think, these other use cases that we're talking about. And the first one that you talked about was test and dev, right? So we are any type of shop that's doing an agile development, even if they're not using agile development, but I think, many people are using agile, right? Is that you can use this to easily spin up whatever you want, to be able to either develop against essentially an active copy of the data. So there's a process when you do this. There's a process that you can go through. I've seen different terms for it: data de-identification, data anonymization, data sanitization. Basically, the only problem with taking a copy of production data and then doing development with it is you've got production data and development, right? Yep. And there's PII there. It's a very American term, but personal identification there that could be a problem if you're using it in development, right? So you could automate this process of taking a production copy and then anonymizing that data so that you're using production-like data in your development. And then also, once you've done your development, you can test it against that. In fact, you could actually, once it's true test, you could test it against actual, non-anonymized data, as long as you kept it in an appropriate environment.
Yeah, and a lot of the companies that were starting in this space, they also refer to it as copy data management. So one of the ones that is very popular at the time was Actifio, right? Yeah. With databases being able to spin off copies. I think they were acquired by IBM, I believe. So things like that, where you have all these copies. It's how do you manage them? How do you make it simple to spin them up? How do you also have the governance in place so people aren't doing bad things with the data?
Yeah. And so I think, and CDM, copy data management, that was, and I am saying I don't hear that too much anymore. You heard it a lot when Actifio was a big brand, right? I think the concept is strong. I think the challenge that most people had with it is that they wanted to boil the ocean with that, right? They wanted to do all the copies. They wanted to have the backup copies plus the,
prod, yep.
Plus all, everything, right? And so it's sort of like CDP. CDP is an amazing concept until you try to pay for it, right? And so you don't want to do everything with CDP. You want to just do what you really need it for. I think what you're seeing with a lot of these products that we're starting to see is that you're starting to see people doing CDM-like use cases with backups. And again, this is because so many of these products are storing backups in a way that allow them to very easily, either the way Veeam does it, or I know, our former employer, Druva, the way they stored the data, they could easily do like this, sort of virtual, like a view representation of the data, very quickly because they're in the cloud and they can, the cloud is magic. So that test and dev is a good example of them. So the next one we have is, let's talk about security and compliance applications here. So what do you think are security applications with things that we can do with backups that we couldn't do, I don't know, 10 years ago?
So the thing about backups is it basically has all the data from everywhere in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You could start to look for patterns. You could look at accesses, who's accessing what data, where copies are going. Um, there's also things you could do. For instance, if you get hit by ransomware, okay, I now understand the signature of the ransomware. Where does that live in my environment? So you now have a centralized location of all your data that you could start searching for
Yeah.
to be able to identify some of these security issues.
You can do like basically SIMSOAR type,
Yeah.
or XDR. Basically, all of these techniques you could do them with a centralized copy of the data.
Yeah.
And I still go back to, I agree with what I used to hear a lot at Druva, which was, if we're the reason that you know that you have a ransomware attack, this is a problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like, but it's still better to know than
Yeah.
to not know, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Hopefully you've got a number of different things, but this is the idea of defense in depth. And you're right, it is a centralized place from which you can see a lot of things, and you can perhaps from that vantage point see patterns that you might not see otherwise. And I got to bring up an old story again from back in the day. And we were implementing this is again in my very first job in backups, and we were going to be implementing what we now think of as like HSM or something. It wasn't HSM. It was just it was like bad HSM, where basically we said, if you've had a file on your file system and you haven't touched it for 18 months, we're going to delete it. We got it on 57 backup tapes. We keep our backup tapes for 7 years. If you really need your file, we can get it back for you, but we need space, and so we're going to start deleting your crap. And as the it's a bit like like with Real ID with the how that they kept delaying the the implementation of Real ID. It was the same thing where, like, as the date approached it, people started getting, and we started getting down to that date of like, okay, this is it. This is the date. And then one day, and mind you, it's just, again, I just got to just give you like what do you call it? A frame of reference here. Our biggest server was 7 gigabytes.
Oh boy.
And what was happening was, and the way we did the backups, we do one weekly full backup, and we didn't have enough tapes to do all the full backups in one day. I'm sorry, tape drives to do all the full backups in one day. We would rotate those full backups across the week. And because again, backups have always been too expensive. This is kind of what the point is, right?
Yeah.
And so, but one day, one of the servers, Zeus, I remember, its incremental backups were shooting through the roof. They were taking forever every single day. Their backups were taking, they weren't finishing. And we started looking, and what we saw was that every file in every home directory was being changed every single day.
Did someone just have like a touch command or something to just...
Yeah. So what happened was somebody called in to the help desk, and they're like, how can we make sure that our stuff doesn't get deleted? And they said, well, put this command in your .profile, right? Which, for those that don't know, Unix was a thing that got ran every time you logged in. And it basically, it wasn't just a touch star. It was like a fine dot pipe to, right? So basically, change the modification time on every single file in your home directory every single time you logged in, which basically meant every night became a full.
Yeah.
And we put a stop to that really quick, and we all referred to it as it was the finance department, and we said we caught the finance department touching themselves. But
oh, Curtis.
Anyway, so where were we? What we were talking
We
about?
finished
Something.
security and compliance.
Yeah. So there is a lot of centralized stuff. You can look for things. So we talked about the security ramifications. We can look for things that are not compliant. We can look for file types that are not compliant. We are not a multimedia making company. There shouldn't be video files. I can think all the way back to my very first job, like after this is my very first consulting job. So it was my first job after that job. And we, without going into details, we found the most inappropriate videos that you could possibly find being stored on servers in our corporate data center. And you can look for videos, you can look for types of files. I remember, I do remember one, a restore that I got. Resume. I told you the resume.doc. Yeah. Somebody says, hey, I want to do the resume.doc. You can look for file names, you can look for file types, and you can use hashes, right? You can look for, there are ways for data to be hidden, right? There are mechanisms you can use to reveal what the real type of a file is, even if the extension or whatever doesn't say that. And so you can do that. You can also look for things like, you can use regular expressions to look for things like, again, I can really only speak to the US. Social security numbers should not be in plain text in a spreadsheet, in a document, right? Other personal identifiers. So you can do compliance. Now, of course, you're going to end up giving yourself more work, but you could potentially save your company millions of dollars in the long run. Yeah. And then finally, we have analytics and business intelligence. And this is something that I think this has been somewhat of a pie in the sky idea for a long time. What do you think?
I would say at least a decade, more than
at least a decade. We've talked about it.
Yep.
And the idea that we're storing all this data, it's randomly accessible. Isn't there some way that we could look at this data and we can do something with it? Again, you've got this centralized view from which we can view the organization, not just like it's like three-dimensional, but it's time as well as now, right?
Yeah.
And I do think, and I think that idea reached a fever pitch a couple of years ago with AI. That we started seeing. How long is ChatGPT been a thing? Because that's really when like AI just filled everyone's brain. Has it been 2 years?
18 months, maybe?
Yeah. So like, but even before that, because I remember, because I know I've gone from Druva for a couple of years now, and before I left Druva, ChatGPT really became a thing, right? And we were like, oh man, we got to figure out a way to connect these things, right? And fast forward to last week, right? Well, 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
I was at VeeamON, and if you follow the show religiously and you listened to a couple episodes ago, you would have seen my talk on this already. But I got to see it. Like it was really amazing where they had a Veeam environment. Now this was like, they made a point of saying that when they demoed, they demoed like over 20 things. And they said, some of the things you're going to see are literally hours old. They're like, we're coding them right now. There's guys, 1,000 monkeys at the keyboard in the back.
Nothing like a live demo.
Nothing like a live demo. And everything. And by the way, they did all this preface. Anton Gostev made all this things like, I hope it works. I hope it, like, it was like, and everything worked flawlessly. It really did. But what I saw was that they had hooked up. Basically, they are now announcing that they're going to be doing this connection between Anthropic MCP and Veeam backups. And I am not an expert in this space, but what I saw, I do use Claude quite a bit, right? Which is the Anthropic tool. what it looked like to me was they had two tabs. One was they had a bunch of backups. They just claimed that what they had was a bunch of backups that were about weather.
Mm-hmm.
So they had one tab that was search, where they could just search, what backups do you have that are about weather? And it came up with like a Google-like search,
Mm-hmm.
which was that alone was cool. But then it was like, what can you tell me about the weather? It had a different tab where it just looked like Claude to me.
Mm.
It was like, tell me, what can you tell me about the weather based on the backups that we have?
Mm.
And it was like, and it basically wrote out a report. And I was like, oh, that is really cool. Right. And I've been in software long enough to know that, that can all be total smoke and mirrors. But it was,
You're like, it was
I
amazing.
watched it, right? It was amazing. Again, it goes back to that. It's made possible by the fact that the backups are stored on disk and stored in a way that you can access them natively.
Yeah.
And so it brings up lots of security and privacy questions. And I had a really good chat with them about that. And they absolutely knew that they needed to come out with their AI statement before this ever touched any customer data. And he did verify to me that there wasn't any path between your data and Anthropic, and that they're not going to be using your data to train anything. It's a private instance. But that was just, it's like the first time you ever, it's like the first time, I don't know, if you haven't at this point gone and used AI in some fashion, if you haven't done some of the amazing things you can do in AI, you got to go try it out. And that first time you do that, you're like, oh my goodness, right?
Yeah.
And it's so good at like summarizing things. That's like, to me, that's like the best. Like, it's never going to come up with anything new technically, but you could also argue there's nothing new under the sun, right?
But it's able to make connections in different ways.
It is able to make connections in different ways, right? Yeah. And suggest things. And we use it all the time for this podcast. We use it to help us come up with titles and to summarize the podcast. And the first time you see it do something like that is amazing.
By the way, we're not.
Remember the episode we actually made AI? We made our AI voices. We actually had an episode where we had because the editor that I use has an AI copy of our voices, and I can fix if I say words wrong. Like I say the wrong word, I can actually fix.
Yeah.
I can swap it out with my voice, and that offends some people. Sorry.
So I know we talked about all these use cases, right? I think the one thing that I think is important is, as a person focused on backup, your primary goal, going all the way back to the beginning, is your insurance for the company. You cannot fail that job, right? The company looks at you for that last line of defense, for making sure everything works. All these other things about doing more with backups are in addition to that core foundational thing. If you ever falter and sort of take away from that core foundation, none of this other stuff matters.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That's a great point, Prasanna, that this is about bringing value to the thing you're already doing. You cannot stop the thing you're already doing. And let me give you a perfect example of something that I have talked to some people about, things they'd like to do with a backup, where I'm like, no. Okay. And this is this idea of the right to be forgotten, right? Where people have discussed the concept of surgically altering backups to take your name out of the backup data. And I'm like, I'm sorry, that is fundamentally against the design of all backups known to man. You cannot go and alter backups, besides the fact that just backups should be immutable.
Yeah.
Hopefully your backups are immutable. They're probably not, statistically speaking, but hopefully they are. And if they're not, you should be looking at that. Go read, listen to our episodes about immutability and how important that is, and how easy it is actually to do that nowadays, right? Versus back in the day. But you can't go focusing on these to the detriment of the core function of backup, right? It's got to do that, because if you do ever actually need your backups, they need to actually do the thing.
Yep.
Yeah. That's a great point to end on, Prasanna. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Curtis. And hopefully my DIY stuff goes okay, or I may be calling you and asking you to fly up to Santa Clara to help me fix whatever I break.
I think that would be a highly inefficient use of both of our time. but I'll be happy to do a FaceTime.
Yes.
Wouldn't be the first time. All right. Well, thank you to our listeners. You're why we're here. And that is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.